Hello, you're listening to Kopi Time, a podcast series on markets and economies from DBS Group Research. I'm Taimur Beg, Chief Economist. Welcome to our 84th episode. Today's episode is unlike anything in the 2.5-year history of Kopi Time. He Ming and Goh Wei Chun are the duo behind what I believe to be the most widely followed financial literacy social net media platforms in Singapore. Under the banner of the woke Salaryman, let me spell it out for you, the THEWOKE, Salaryman, all one word. Their content is followed in impressive numbers. On Instagram, they have over 357,000 followers. On Telegram, there are nearly 37,000 subscribers. On Facebook, the platform is listed under Finance Blog with the description, important knowledge for people who earn less than $4,500 a month. On Telegram, the description is a little more evocative, save money and other cool shit, and then retire before 65, hopefully. I think this is going to be fun. Ming and Wei Chun, welcome to Kopi Time.
Hey, thank you, Taimur. That was a very lofty introduction, and I hope that
we live the expectations.
We can live up to the hype.
We were exchanging messages last night, and I said, I have very high expectations, and I'm sure you'll surpass it. And I got a little sweaty emoji in back. Hey guys, let's begin with the beginning. All superhero stories have an origin story. So let's start with yours. How did it all start? And who does what in this dynamic duo of yours?
You want to do this?
No, you say how we start first.
All right.
I think it's more of your thing.
Okay. So I think I used to work in advertising, I think back in 2018. And I think one thing that people always ask me was the money stuff, because I was quite
money-minded.
Yeah, I was quite money-minded. I was saying, you guys should save money, you guys should invest. And when I showed people like the resources that I use to learn more about finances, they always say like, oh, this is too boring, I can't read it. So I thought like, how do we reach out to these very short attention span people?
Like millennials, is that what you mean?
No. Just short attention span people. Like the people who don't want to read through like maybe 800 words of text, which is quite a low bar, but still these people exist.
And they could be young or they could be old. It doesn't have to be only millennials.
Okay. Yeah. So I thought we could find a way to bring like emotion, and we find a way to add visuals to it. It could actually make for quite a potent combination. So I think sometime in 2019, I wrote an article about how to save 100 grand before you turn 30. And then I shared it as an article. It was quite a long article, but it was written in non-jargony kind of prose. And then I told Wei Chun, like, you know what? This actually did well even without those fancy images we talked about. If you drew something, I think it could do even better. And then he drew it, and then the first comic that we created got around like 6,000 shares on the first
on Facebook.
Yeah,
which
on
is
Facebook.
It's really good.
Facebook.
Yeah, so that was quite an impressive launch, I would say.
Yeah.
And then I think from there we realized that the platform had a lot of potential, and we just have been going at it ever since.
Yeah, because like before that even happened, like Remy and I are friends. We're friends first, and then we were friends from poly. We go way back, and we've always socially met up. Then we've always been talking about because we were also a little bit tired of the rat race. The topic whenever we go out will just invariably become, hey, how do we make money? How do we start a business? How do we escape the thing? So we've always been trying things here and there also, sometimes together, sometimes on our own. So when this thing happened and it got 6,000 shares, we were like, hey, this is it. Like we can maybe make something out of this. So from then on, we sort of got the idea that we might be able to make a company out of this.
So the initial plan was that we use Salaryman as like a portfolio piece. We'll show people that, hey, you know what? We know how to simplify complex things and make people care about a possibly boring subject. So we would use this as evidence to convince clients to let us run their social media accounts and create their social media content.
Or do workshops with it.
Yeah, or do workshops or do like corporate training.
Yeah.
I think along the way, we found out that creating content that helps educate people makes more sense, and it's something that we rather spend most of the time doing. So we have kind of pivoted to sponsor content.
So before 29, Ming, you said that you were in the advertising world. Wei Chun, given your drawing expertise, what was your background before that?
So actually, my dream since I was 14 years old was to be an animator. I wanted to write and direct and make animated films. And I went to school. I got a bachelor's degree in of arts, majoring in animation, and I also went on to get a postgraduate master's degree in majoring in animation, and I wrote about expressing Singapore national identity through animation, which is a very specific thing, So I kind of realized, when it was close to graduation time, that there are a lot of things I want in life that actually a career in animation would make it a bit more difficult for me to afford. Because Singapore, right, compared to our regional neighbors, right, our cost of living is very high. And animation specifically, right, is a very labor-intensive job. So compared to our foreign neighbors like Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, which are all like big hubs of animation of themselves, right? Like it's quite difficult for you to do something and then still have a certain amount of salary. And when I was closing to graduation, I sort of looked at what the price of a house would be, or if I ever wanted to own something nice like a car, how much that would be. And I realized that actually it would be a really uphill job. So I actually never even though I got a postgraduate degree in animation, I've never been an animator full time. I've never worked that as a job. I felt like I kind of sell out a little bit, but in a roundabout way, doing the work Salaryman has been the closest I've ever gotten to being able to make my own visual story. So in fact, what I did was instead of just like being a stickler, like forcing myself to do animation, I realized that one of the bigger, like it's a Venn diagram thing, if animation is this small thing, there's a bigger thing around it, and that's visual storytelling. Yep. So it's really cool that we have the work Salaryman. I can sort of apply what I love about visual storytelling in a comic way to, what I loved about animation last time. So in a roundabout way, it has sort of happened for me as well. Yeah.
No, I think the visual storytelling part is what is, I think, the really, really powerful about your platform. Question about the name of the platform, because people coming from, say, a Western persuasion, think of the word woke, a bit of a loaded word these days. I think yours is a more of a sincere interpretation of that word, but walk us through, why did you name the platform Woke Salaryman?
Sure. I think, number one, I think if we follow like the Western interpretation, I think that there's definitely some negative connotation there. But as a Singaporean page and like a page that is in Asia, I think it's important not to kind of take a Eurocentric view of the world, right? Like, I think people are free to define what the word means to them, as long as it doesn't like to put in a very crude way to shit on what other people think of the word. And I think that's what the word woke in our context means. I think locally, when you say like, oh, I wish I woke up sooner, this means like, I wish I realized sooner. Actually, that has a lot of similarities with what the Western meaning of the word also means, because if I'm not wrong, in some ways, the Western definition is to like something along the lines of being aware.
Social awakening.
Yeah, social awakening. Yeah. So I guess this is like a financial awakening. So I guess in a way, we wanted to portray the idea of an awakening. And I guess when you are creating a brand on social media, using a word like the awakened salaryman sounds kind of...
it's not like the woke salaryman very easy to say also. Like, yeah. But the awakened salaryman is even more
it's more mouthful. So we thought, we think it's acceptable. And I think at that time, it was
not so taboo when we came out.
Yeah, exactly.
That's right.
So the term has, of course, evolved since then.
Yeah.
Right. But we often get the question, will you ever rename yourself? I think when the time comes, we might possibly consider. We're always open to that happening. But at the present, I think there's no need yet.
Yeah.
Right. I don't think it's hurting your reach or popularity at all. But the second part of the name, Salaryman, which is a Japanese expression. So why did you pick that part as well?
Wow. Why did we pick that? I think being a salaryman would be the epitome of what people consider being stuck in the rat race or being a slave. So I think since our page initially focused a lot on financial independence, I think that was quite a natural thing to do. But I think most importantly, if you put the word woke salaryman, it kind of has like a decent ring to it. So I would say when we came on name, we did not put a lot of thought into it at the moment. Actually, we just wanted to something that sounded catchy and something memorable.
Okay, I'll let go of the discussion on the title, except for one more question, which is on Telegram, it is woke salary people.
Yeah.
Why did you do that?
All right. So you see, when we are writing things, we are the woke salaryman because we're male, right? But I think on Telegram, we wanted to be more inclusive, I guess. I mean, we're trying around with being inclusive. So we put work salary, people, I guess. Just to, just to test how it will be received. But I think work salary people just doesn't have the same natural ring to the term salaryman, which exists organically. So we've considered naming ourselves the work salary people, but if you think about it from what is logical and what exists in the real world, that just isn't as organic.
So you're just trying it out.
Yeah, I mean,
Sure.
yeah.
So look, guys, in this podcast, every time I finish a podcast, after a week or so, I can go and look at this amazing data dashboard that the provider of the software of the platform provides to me. So I can see who in the world is listening to my podcast, how long, and all that kind of stuff. And I'm sure you get very similar data. So you have a very good sense of who your audience happens to be. So give us a sense of your demographic.
Yeah, so I think right now it's still mostly Singaporeans, but we do have like growing numbers of readers in places in Southeast Asia, in Australia, the US, and actually surprisingly the UK as well. So I think we are getting a bit of a global audience. I think it's because a lot of things we talk about, young people are actually facing the same problems around the world, which is why they find the content relatable. I think issues such as inequality, expensive housing, foreign talent competing with them for their jobs, unstable markets, the rise of cryptocurrency. I think these are all quite hot topics, at least if you live in any major metropolitan area in the world.
I think our audience also skews a bit younger, but not so young where we can still like very effectively reach young people who have not started work yet. So I think around like 18 to 35-ish, that's usually the range that we hit at. We've also tried to sort of make content for specific niche, for example, women specifically, or like we also try to sometimes when we have something to say about something that, because money is not just money, like money overlaps with a lot of things like societal issues or relationship issues and things like that. So we've also made pieces talking about like the relationship between younger and older people. And sometimes, we might write it in a way that is on purpose to incense and kind of hook and then make people a bit like, you see the headline, you're a bit like angry, but when you read it, then there's more like objectivity to it later on, So we do reach out now and again to sort of reach beyond our demographic here.
Yeah.
And is it a responsive audience? Do you get a lot of feedback from your listeners and viewers?
Yeah, I think it's a double-edged sword because like the feedback is both can be very kind, and because sometimes people do disagree like vehemently with us. So the feedback can be pretty nasty as well.
I think part of running a page like this sometimes is to understand that it's different because like last time, if you imagine like if you went back to say like the golden age of cinema in the 1940s, like there's no way in like somebody can, I don't know, like private message Clark Gable if they didn't like his movies, they have to write a letter, it'll be sent to his team and then they'll read it and it's angry and they just toss it away. But now it's so direct that everybody can reach you. And actually like we read almost all the comments that people put, but we just don't have the time to reply to all of them. But, when we first started it and we first started getting traction and we started getting our first hit of like negative comments, which is actually a symptom of being successful, because when you first hit with the audience, right, it's usually people who find you because they like your stuff. But when they start sharing your stuff more and more, you will start to reach people that naturally don't like your content or they're not kind of in the same frequency that you're at. And that is a good thing because sometimes you can convert some of them or like sort of change their minds. But a lot of times they also get angry and that is actually just part and parcel of what we do. So we have to oftentimes remind one another when we see comments that we don't like to remember the long goal, that this is a part of the process that, we're not influencers, we're not playing that game, but we still have that same sort of thing that comes at us. So as a mental health kind of thing, we have to know how to zoom out and understand that, these are oftentimes also people who might have bad days and whatever. So perspective is so important.
I think sometimes people are just projecting their insecurities. So
all the time, I do it too, right?
So I think
human.
The comments aren't always rational, but I think of course it definitely hurts you a bit.
Yeah.
Sometimes it does cut quite deeply. Yeah. I think in the long term, we recognize that this is a privilege of reaching a large audience. For example, if I had an audience of 2 people, I mean, the likelihood of them disagreeing me or disliking me is really low. But let's say I reach like 3 million people.
Yeah.
Even 1% of that audience will be 30,000 people
who are angry
at you, disliking you, and I think it's just part of the job, I guess.
Right, and I think that's the explosive aspect of social media, that 1% can be so loud that it will take away the validation you get from the 99% unless you're a very strong personality, right? And we see that both in terms of sort of business content as well as personal content. Whenever people get criticized, they put a very large negative weight to that as opposed to words of appreciation or praise. But I'm going to talk a little bit about your content, but those who are not listening to this podcast but watching it on YouTube, they'll be seeing you with a background of an office, some activity behind, a few boxes. Where are you?
We are at a place called Farrer Park in Singapore. It's a relatively new office. It's a nice place, it's new. We're the first tenants here. We stepped it up during the COVID pandemic. So I think we got it for a good price. And that's a very important thing to us, We have to live the values that we preach, about like spending less than you earn, So it's quite bare. That I have a lot of ideas for being an artistic person. I want to do it up nicely, but I also look at the cost and maybe we save that for later, So I would describe it as a humble and realistic place, It's not that we don't have the finances to make it up very nicely, but we need to be very careful with how we spend because, and I think this has been our value since day one, that we are. For example, in contrast with a lot of these like VC companies, these startups that get a lot of seed capital in the initial stages and then they can afford very nice things, we've always been very brick and mortar and very traditional when it comes to the way that we spend our money. So maybe it's a good thing, maybe it's a bad thing. I felt kind of bad about it, especially in the beginning, because we have a lot of peers, like our friends who run businesses and the offices are very swanky and nice. And I also like, hey, why can't we also have nice things? But because we own the company, there's no equity, there's no shareholder apart from us. We prefer to live our values like that. So that's, I guess, one of the drawbacks about working with us. The office is not going to be super swanky.
I think also we are entering like a period of like economic uncertainty, and like the lower your OPEX,
your burn rate, right?
the longer you can survive. So I think
absolutely.
This is, whether you're a person or a company, reducing your expenditure is just one way to bring certainty in an uncertain world, which I feel that is quite underrated right now.
Yeah, so our office is not, say, very nice, and then we jury rig a lot of things. Like the fridge, for example, is from my mother-in-law. That she got the spare one. So I feel like there's a charm to it, and I like that. I sort of like that about us also.
I noticed a couple of staff members in the background. That means it's not just the two of you. Woke Salaryman is now a bigger team than just the two of you.
Yeah, there's 5 of us in total. So we have 3 other colleagues, 2 of who draw for us, and then one, Viv, she is our business development person.
Yeah.
Right. And actually our boss also, because she just tells us what to do when we do it.
She actually used to be from DBS. So
I see.
Yeah.
All right, let's talk about content. You have already touched on this issue, which is that you cover actually issues that go beyond financial literacy. But first, let's just focus on the matters of personal finance, from stock picking to long-term saving. So describe for me your content generation process, please.
Wow. Okay. I think I would say it's very haphazard. Actually, most of the time, content angles happen because Rachel and I have a conversation, and both of us either like disagree or we feel very strongly about something, and that's when we decide to turn it into a piece of content. Because I used to be a copywriter and I worked in an agency, and how we used to come up with content there was to look at the content calendar, and then we see like, what dates are coming out. So, for example, this month is September, right? So of course there will be a Teachers' Day post. Then
the next one got Halloween, so let's prep a Halloween post.
Yeah, and what I just found out long term, this is just a shitty way to create.
You're finding excuses to make
good content. So what we found was a lot more sustainable was to find things you care about, and then be independent of the content calendar and just create your own content on your own terms, rather than following what everyone else does.
Yeah.
So that's our content creation process. I think we also try to talk about not just money and investing, but also like the stuff that money investing
overlaps.
Overlaps or eventually affects. Because it's not just about gaining money, it's also about how you spend it, what you do with your money, because all these things have great impact upon an individual's life.
And do you guys take each other's content and edit it and re-edit it? I mean, it's like many iterations, or you're not a sweet spot where you can do these things pretty easily?
Wow. I think we have a set sort of standard practice, but what we often deliberate on whenever we do ping pong back and forth, right, would be the front part, which is the writing. Because all of our comics, articles, whatever, right, they all start on Google Docs. So he will send me something, or I might write a draft and I'll send him. Then he will give me feedback, I give him feedback. Then we just go back and forth until it's done. Then during the production process, then I sort of take over where I talk about I'll deal more with the storytelling aspect, the visual metaphors. Are they clear enough? Are they too heavy-handed? And then we also get his feedback on that. So Google Docs has made it very easy for us to work extremely quickly. It's very interesting because we started just before COVID, or just when COVID was starting, and that was when everybody was doing office work, So we started off in a very remote way where we were communicating mainly on Facebook Messenger and Google Docs. So we have always been like that, and that has made it very fast for us to do changes. Even when we go on leave, we will use Google Docs to send each other. Then when we have a few minutes before bedtime, even when I'm on leave, I might look at the story, just to vet it and stuff. So it's very organic, haphazard, but that also allows us to
be agile, right?
Be very agile, yeah.
That's a good corporate term, agile, yes.
Without the dots in between.
Yes.
It's just fast for us.
Absolutely. Share with us some of your favorite posts. And when I talk about favorite posts, there are two ways, right? That one is how satisfied you are in terms of conveying something exactly the way you wanted to. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the audience would like it. Sometimes you do something that you may not think is your best, but you would get an incredibly good audience response. So from both dimension, tell us about some of the things that are notable.
Maybe I start first. So my favorite thing that we did was it was a story called Rich People Problems, which actually in hindsight is quite a bad title. Basically, it's just this very narrative and dramatic story about a guy who's at a bar, and basically he's telling a story to the bartender. You know how people get drunk, then they vent to the bartender and they reveal their deepest, darkest insecurities, right? So this person was just venting to the bartender about how I'm a very rich person. I've made a lot of money, but, in doing so, I'm estranged from my family. But, tomorrow I'm going to quit my business. I'm going to go and spend time with my kids. I'm going to turn it all around. But it turns out that the bar is actually a limbo space, meaning this person is dead and it's too late to turn things around. So saying basically it's a very simple parable about how, you want to make money, you want to be able to provide for your family, but you also want to actually be there for your family, to have the time to spend that money on your family, So it's a very simple thing. But when I was writing it, it was very early in our foundation, so up till then we've done very, I would say almost TED Talk presentation-y kind of things where here's 5 reasons you should do this, how I managed to save 100K by 30. So this was a big leap in terms of storytelling for me. And during the creation process, I was so insecure about it. Because I knew the twist. And when you're working on something and you're drawing and iterating, you're looking at the thing again and again and again. So I was thinking the twist is not going to work. It's going to be too predictable. Who's not going to see that this guy is dead? And I was so insecure about it. I remember uploading the images, the final images, and I wanted to just cancel it and not upload it because I thought it was just crap. It's just not a good piece of content. But when it eventually went up, it did actually very well. People said that they teared up reading the thing, which is just a great compliment to me. I just think when you make somebody cry with your content, it hits on a new level, right? Because you're making that person essentially lose their emotional composure. Which I think is a great compliment. So I remember during that part, I learned a great lesson about confidence and not being able to, not sabotaging myself, but also during that process, a mantra that Riming, necessarily so kept nagging at me, which was that done is better than perfect. It's never going to be perfect. And the more and closer you get towards perfection, right, it just becomes you spend more and more amount of time to polish off increasingly small amounts of perfection.
It's a diminishing returns.
Diminishing returns, yeah. So that was a great lesson and something that I still struggle with being an artist. And my ego is that my work is who I am and my quality as an artist. But we are also making content for people. Social media has to be fast. So a lot of great lessons, and also I felt great about the impact of that post. So that was my favorite story.
I think my favorite post was something we did, actually a piece of sponsored content we did for Workforce Singapore. So it was a story about how my dad dealt with the 1997 Asian financial crisis. And it detailed, moments of my childhood, from the time like when my dad came home one day mysteriously on a weekday and just took me out for lunch. And as a kid, I was thinking, oh, man, this is strange. Like,
Why are you home?
yeah, why are you home? Should you be like working and stuff? But later on, as a kid, I only found out that he had been retrenched, and the story was actually a retrospective approach to see like how my dad dealt with retrenchment. I think we shared it, and eventually it got received very well. Even like the Prime Minister shared it. Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong shared it. Actually,
On Father's Day.
yeah, on Father's Day,
Talking about Lee Kuan Yew,
Yeah,
which was like, what?
yeah, and I showed that to my dad, who is a great fan of like Lee Kuan Yew, and he didn't tear, but like I would like to think that he would have.
I think he teared later. He
Yeah,
go toilet, then, oh no.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
But I think he was really happy that his story actually.
It resonated with the Prime Minister of the country so much.
Exactly.
Then it reminded him of
Yes.
his father, who was a founding father of the nation. That's insane.
Yeah, you can definitely take a bow for that one, Remig. No question about that. It's so interesting that you shared that particular incident. I was with a colleague last week, and he told me almost a very similar story. He did not express it the way you did, but he was growing up in KL. In late 90s, and his dad had a business which went bankrupt around the 97, 98 crisis. And he was telling me how in these, the 25 years since that crisis, as he has sort of become an adult and a professional, how that experience has scarred him and influenced his attitude toward investment, family, his tolerance for risk. Everything was fundamentally shaped by that pivotal incident, which I'm sure also had a huge impact on you.
Yeah, because I mean, like from a storytelling point of view, I mean, like some of the greatest victories are risen up from the greatest defeats. Like these crucibles from where these great stories come from. That's something that we look for a lot also. So yeah, it's very relatable. Yeah.
I think also by drawing on history, we can teach people perspectives, right? Because crises often repeat themselves.
History repeats itself.
Yeah. So there was like the tulip crisis in the past, great financial crisis, dot-com bubble. So I think especially in the past 2 years during the pandemics when markets were hot, I think we tried to bring in some of this historical perspective to let people know that, hey, you know what, there are boom and bust cycles. What you're experiencing now is probably part of a boom cycle. It might not last forever. So you also try to bring that to help people see that, as the saying goes, like past performance does not indicate future results. And that applies to their investment stock portfolios today as well.
It is amazing how, regardless of where in history we stand, we always think that this time is different, that the past is not going to, come back to haunt us. And every single time it does. So a few years ago, Kenneth Rogoff at Harvard and Carmen Reinhardt, they wrote a book called This Time It's Different. And that book entire point was that, debt crisis, even if you go back 500 years, you see the same fragility build up that leads to crisis and the same kind of pain in terms of joblessness and country insolvency that follow. But every single time when that crisis is about to happen, some people say, this time is different. It's not going to be like the past. And then we are unfortunately then weighed down by history again and proven wrong.
Yeah. I think in defense of those people, like, it is different, but slightly different.
The factors are different, but the grand, the macro outlook is
the same.
Thing,
it's like fear and greed.
Yeah,
exactly.
Like history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes, right? So it just rhymes the same way.
Right.
Yeah.
Very good. So you've been doing this for over 3 years. You get a lot of feedback from your viewers and readers. What are young investors doing right, and what are they not doing right?
I think young investors are not doing right because a lot of them are chasing maximum gains, like the fastest gains. I think we saw that particularly last year where in crypto, where people were laughing at like 10 to 20% a year. They say like, oh, these are rookie numbers, There's some protocol that gives me 10,000 per year.
Yeah.
So why should I bother with long-term investing? Why should I bother with value investing?
8% is a joke to them.
Yeah. So I think many people were after fast gains, and I think this year was a big reality check to people's egos. I think last year you had people overconfident in their investment strategy. They were saying things like diversification is for idiots. It's only for people who do not know what they're doing. But I think important thing is to realize that history is life is very uncertain. Most of us do not know what we're doing.
Yeah.
So diversification makes sense.
And it's a sort of wisdom to understand that about yourself, that I'm not good enough to go and pick stocks myself. So there's a wisdom in that I think also people should embrace, especially young people. But I think relating to this, I think it was a few months ago, I was on the bus and there were students in uniform that were sitting in front of me and they were talking about crypto and talking about investments and APYs and stuff. And I'm like, what? When I was your age, I was talking about Pokemon and all this stuff, all these toys and cartoons and stuff, Yeah. So I think that also reflects on the good side of things where at least they're talking about it, and that conversation is there. I don't know if it's a sign of the times and you can't ascribe it or give them the credit for talking about it, but maybe it's the accessibility of having it on your phone now and everybody has a phone. So the barriers to investing, last time you open a brokerage account or actually get in touch with a broker, to even start investing. And now that's different. So maybe it's easier, but at least they're talking about it. And I think that's good. So the fact that what happened recently, I think is a good thing actually, because it gives everybody a reality check and you're living through a recession or a so-called recession yourself. And that is a great learning point. So what I tell young people now is that keep your eyes open, see what's happening, because you can use this for the next time this happens. It rhymes. It's going to rhyme with this thing.
So it's good that they're starting young, and maybe it's good that for some people, we pop that bubble early. That bubble of unrealistic expectations, or Robert Shiller would say irrational exuberance.
That's right.
Yeah, but the bad news is that some older millennials put a lot of their life savings in the stock market. They were burnt this time. So I think that can't be ignored. But I think overall, it's still a positive thing, I guess, that people are getting started early and they care a lot more about finances these days.
Did the meme stock phenomenon from the US, did it make it to the shores of Singapore?
Yeah, for sure. I think
we know people that have bought into it at a high point and not made out well.
I think because we do these things called IG Q&A, so we try to answer questions from our community. I think during the whole of last year, people were asking what do you think of GameStop? What do you think of AMC?
Dogecoin.
What do you think of Dogecoin? I think whenever people ask a question like this, it's a sign that they are not really to actually invest. Because they're just looking for
a magic bullet,
a quick stop pick. So they want someone to just say here is the solution to all your problems in life. But actually, life isn't so complex. So I often try to ignore those questions.
I'll share with you one anecdote in terms of this desire for magic bullet transcends time. So when I was 22, a friend of mine explained to me that all you need is $2,000 to retire in 30 years' time. Because if you put it in the stock market, and if you're smart, you'll grow 20% a year. So the power of compounding 20% a year for 30 years, more than enough, that's all you need. And then the other one is, I think this was just a few months before the subprime crisis in Virginia. I was at lunch. And just you heard kids in the bus talk about it, behind me were two college students, and all they were talking about was, what's the point of college? If we could only get into the subprime business and make so much money, and we can retire by the time we're 25, 28, and buy multiple homes and get passive income. That they kept on saying that passive income for the rest of our lives.
Kids talking about getting into the subprime business.
Yeah, so basically their hope was that they would become property agents, but at the same time they would borrow money from banks to leverage some property and then keep on flipping them. They were a bit late in the game because a couple of months after that, the party was over. But yeah, and then now, that was 2008. Now in 2022, somebody thought that they would be able to punt on Bitcoin and make a lot of money. So guys, that takes me to this question that Singapore is a modern society. There are cutting edge banks and fintech companies here offering a wide range of financial products, whether it is buying stocks or mutual funds or insurance. But do you see any gaps in products and financial services for young Singaporeans?
Well, to be honest, not really at the moment. I think because most Singaporeans will agree that they're already pretty well served by something as simple as CPF, which is what the government does. So when it comes to financial planning for long term, I don't think there are gaps there. Then recently there were a lot of digital banks, These days, there are fractional trading. So I think right now, as a layman, I do not see any gaps in the market at the moment.
And so, like, let's say, we're having this discussion in the first week of September. Interest rates are going up very sharply around the world, including in Singapore, and some banks have raised fixed deposit rates. And you think that even for somebody who makes, say, less than $4,500 a month, there are plenty of inexpensive avenues where they can set aside money and get incremental returns on those investments. And between large banks as well as sort of the agile fintech companies, there is a wide spectrum of products that you can suggest to people that they can go and access.
For sure. I think, let me just use the example of cryptocurrencies. So I think last year everyone was saying, crypto would be a way to serve the unbanked. It would be a way to help people. Will actually help the poorer segment of the population get financial services. But I think in Singapore, there's stuff like Singapore savings bonds. You can set up a bank account relatively easily. The barriers here are not as high as elsewhere in the world, which are less developed. So I would say in Singapore, there aren't huge gaps in the market. I mean, there are definitely gaps that people can go to and try to fill in the future, but no serious gaps at the moment.
Good. Good to hear that. I also, sitting in DBS, I'm looking around the financial sector landscape, and clearly, because of the fintech tailwind that we have had over the last 4 or 5 years, I think whether you're a large institution or a small institution, everybody's looking over their shoulders and trying to match whatever new products that's coming in. This was not the case in the past. I mean, even 10, 12 years ago, if you wanted to trade stocks or if you wanted to trade ETFs, not that easy. Right now, the e-trading platforms have certainly come a long way. Let's talk. We were discussing earlier that, your content is not just about financial well-being and financial literacy. I've seen lately, you've done segments of job satisfaction, on personal branding, by the way, which I really, really liked. So what is the thinking behind that?
Well, I think many times when people talk about personal finance, they just think about investing and saving, right?
So min-max everything.
Yeah,
right?
So they're either like the coupon cutters or like, I want to get the best cashback, I want to get the most miles. But that's actually, a lot of it's actually spending. When they go on about investing, a lot of them are actually focusing on like picking stocks. But that might not always be suitable for the layperson. What the layperson actually needs to do is to actually work on their earning power. And that actually has a lot to do with their job. Because if you don't earn a lot, you cannot invest a lot. And it's a lot easier to earn, let's say, 5% off $100,000. And that way you earn $5,000 than to turn $1,000 into $5,000. So I think focusing on earning power is what most people should do. And we tackle the topics surrounding that. So like how to get a pay raise, how to realize like a workplace is toxic, why you should negotiate, why you should market yourself. So I think that's why our content doesn't just cover investments, insurance, or saving money.
I also think there's a great deal of subjectivity that surrounds the objectivity of finance, because it's not just about min-maxing everything and getting the highest amount of percentage return you can. You also need to sort of balance that with who you are as a person. What kind of risk are you willing to take on? And what are your life goals, and what is the enough point in life? I've seen examples of people who make a lot of money, but they sort of get into the trap of just chasing money for money's sake, which is something that when you chase money, right, it improves your quality of life up to a certain extent, and then I think it tapers off if you don't define your life goals and what you actually want to do. So I think it's very important to also talk about these softer issues, with not just how can you earn as much money as possible, but also what do you want to do and how much money do you need to do what you want to do. And this is a lot more to do with also everybody having their own introspection, to do their own journaling, so to speak, to understand what they are. Because it can be pretty miserable to not have enough money, but it can also be equally miserable if you have money, but you don't know why you are actually after this race. Because it's not easy to earn money. Right, so you better make sure that the slices of life that you're cutting off to do this thing is worth something at the end. What is that?
So how to get money and what to eventually do with the money that you have. I think these are very good.
And to be realistic with how much money it takes to do something. Like, for example, the idea of owning a car. It's a very nice idea. And Singapore in particular is very expensive to own a car because of the exorbitant prices of the certificate of entitlements. This is compared to the rest of the world. For example, Malaysia, where I'm from, owning a car is like nothing. So when you consume media from other countries, for example, you might get this very unrealistic expectation about owning a car. And in Singapore, that's going to cost you a lot of money. And unless you're realistic about your financial planning, or getting a car, when you can't afford to do so in Singapore, might actually be a very disastrous thing for your finances. So something like that, it has to be leveled against what you want to do. So if I want a car, the trade-off that I need to understand maybe is that I can't have as chill a life as I want. And that's not a bad thing to have a chill life or not. But if you want this, you better be able to afford it and make the necessary sacrifices.
I think recently we've also been talking about like larger world issues. So for example, like why inflation happens, how come your city is becoming more expensive, why are housing prices inflated at the moment, what it takes for a country and especially Singapore to be successful or remain successful. Because I think without like a broader understanding of the stuff that's happening around the world, the world can seem like quite an unfair place. You can feel like there's no hope or no chance. I would say by helping people see the big picture, they can then like pinpoint like problems that they can actually tackle instead of assuming that, you know what, this is beyond my control, I'm just going to give up.
The system is rigged. There's no chance that I can make it out. So I'm thinking like, I always say like we should eventually like sort of redo our motto and our tagline instead of like talking about like making finance more accessible, to zoom out a bit to talk about like, we want to help people understand how to see the bigger picture, which is what I think economists do, which is why I love talking to economists, because you guys see the bigger picture, and sometimes like it's hard to see the bigger picture when you're worried about rent, you're worried about your tomorrow's salary, whether you're going to make enough money, to even understand the global events, the seismic events that are happening overseas. And then the result of that is that you might be resentful, and that's not very nice, So we always really think like global and macro understanding is so important, but we're thinking constantly about how do we make it more and more accessible? Because it can sound very, it can sound a bit like, insensitive when somebody's worried about next week's rent, and then you are asking them to think about the big picture, and that's why inflation is increasing, and that's why you shouldn't be so angry and upset at this or that person. So there's a level of tension and sensitivity that we need to navigate here, and we are trying to do better every day at that.
But we do believe that overall, and at the end of the day, the person who's struggling will benefit
from knowing
the big picture.
Yeah.
But let's talk about that tension a little bit more. I look at Singapore's data right now. We have inflation at 7%. We've seen, gasoline prices at the petrol pump go up substantially, come down a bit, but still very high by recent standards. And we all know about the issue related to housing and rent in Singapore. But at the same time, the export sector is doing very, very well. The economy is reopening. The hotels are full. Changi Airport is getting busier by the day. We have Formula One coming up. So I find Singapore at an interesting crossroad. On one hand, global headwinds are certainly noticeable. China is a very big sense of worry. On the other hand, Singapore has sort of done well riding through this COVID storm. So when you again talk about the Gen Z or millennial demographics that you are catering to, what is the vibe you're picking up? Is there a substantial amount of anxiety or sort of mid-level anxiety?
I think most of the anxiety are centered around like bread and butter stuff, like standard of living, housing costs, why they're so expensive. I think the pandemic has really caused a delay of housing supply. So many Gen Zs are extremely concerned about that. As far as, whether Gen Z or millennials even benefit from the successes that Singapore has, I think that might be slightly more complex. Because, let's say during COVID, we saw this thing called like the K-shaped recovery, right? Some people emerge from the pandemic for the better, others for the worse. I think it's that way, not just in the stock market, but also in the general populace as well, all over the world, across generations.
I also think like qualitatively, like what the Gen Zs are thinking a lot about, and what the struggle for identity also is very prevalent. I think much more so than the previous generation. That they think a lot about like what is the meaning of work. Is it just pure productivity? And also, how does productivity factor into my identity? Which is, I think, something that might sound fluffy, but might have to be addressed. That's where I think like this quiet quitting thing comes from. That's where this lie flat movement and all this stuff about, 9 to 5 rat race and all that. Because in my parents' generation, that wasn't even a thing. They just did work, and work was something that you just did. So this thing about identity and people, like the Great Resignation, I think also has a lot to do with that. This is something that I think this new generation has to sort of figure that out, because productivity still has to come. But how does that factor in? Do people burn out faster or not? Like, that's something that I'm very keen to keep an eye on. Yeah.
Right. Slight pivot from that issue, but it's very interesting nonetheless. So I recently read this survey about the eroding level of trust in large financial institutions in America. And the survey, which was sort of done by fintech company, so serves their purpose well, which is the conclusion was that, for Gen Z, it is easier to trust or embrace a fintech as opposed to a large financial institution. Does the same hold for Singapore?
I think in Singapore, it's a slightly different climate because I think trust in government is a lot higher than, let's say, in the United States. I think a lot of people are less skeptical of the government as a credible, financial institution. If I can describe governments as financial institutions, or even like large corporations. And the assumption is governments will oversee large financial corporations. So there's definitely a level of trust there that is not so much in the US. Because in the US, there's like the Enron crisis, back in the day, there was Lehman Brothers. So there are a lot more scandals, a lot more high profile scandals that might shape the perception of how young people see large financial institutions there. But I'll say like in Singapore, it's not so much the case. Actually, in fact, I think people might approach newer companies with more skepticism. And I say this because every time we do a sponsored post with like a newish organization, people ask like, what happens if this shuts down? So they are very aware that all these new players, they might not be established, and with that comes the risk of them not being around in the next 5 to 10 years. And I think that's a fair assumption.
Maybe it's a Singaporean thing.
Yeah, maybe it's a kiasi, not kiasi. Maybe it's like
scared to die.
Scared to die. Yeah. So it could be that.
Well, I think it's a smart thing to do. I think embrace all of these things. Trust but verify, I think, is important as well. Staying with that final issue, that level of anxiety or questioning about, what is the meaning of purposeful work. It seems to me that, the culture that we hear from China, the 996, I think Singaporeans are ready to move past that and would demand far greater flexibility and accommodation from their employers than this. So along that line, do you see the next generation of Singaporeans actually becoming more entrepreneurial and perhaps even more keen to hop jobs as opposed to looking for jobs for life and only looking at large companies as the place for refuge?
I think it would depend on like who you're asking. Let's be real. When you're talking about like the full spectrum of benefits, it's very likely that only a very small percentage of people can get it all. They can get a high salary, they can get work from home, they can get flexible benefits, they can get unlimited days leave. Only a very small percentage of people will be able to get all of that because they have talent, they are mobile, they can work in anywhere they would want. So I think it's important to state that upfront. Not everyone will be able to get all the benefits, but I think as a whole, there's a greater pivot in mindset towards more work-life balance, more sustainable styles of working, especially those that focus on people's mental health. I think the challenge would be, how can Singaporeans justify being paid a Singaporean salary while someone else might possibly do the same job elsewhere for a lot more cheaper, right? Yeah. I think the key here is for Singaporeans to move up the value chain. I think it's not a pleasant message to say, but it's what we must do. We must learn how to do the jobs that cheaper labor cannot do. I think that's the brutal truth. We have to do the jobs that machines can't do. And that is how we will be able to enjoy work-life balance. We will get high salary. That's how we will enjoy like a Singaporean standard of living while also all the benefits that we want. If not, there's going to be a very huge gap between expectation and reality.
On the entrepreneurial side of things, I tend to think, and this might not be true, because I'm not from Singapore, I'm from Malaysia. I feel like one of the defining features of Singaporeanness is prudence, like the idea that you are safer rather than you will take that risky jump, So I think that serves very well for business as well, especially in this post like rising interest rate world. So I think that might be very good, but also like I've never sort of felt like Singaporeans were very good risk takers, but that's just from my personal opinion. I feel like, but when they do take that leap, like they are more prudent with it, and I feel like that's a good sign. I do echo what Rin Ming says when on that other side of things. I really think like as a foreigner myself, like the reason why I'm even here was that my mom sent me here to study because she recognized that Singapore's economy was better than Malaysia. So the result of that in the past 20 years, I think, is that there is now a big bunch of competition coming regionally, especially with the COVID thing, pushing things remotely, that Singaporean youths need to be very careful and aware of the competition that surrounds them. And they have to be very understanding of the market forces because let's just be honest, like I'm not the best artist in the world, right? If it's just down to technical skill, I can find somebody just as good or better than me in the regional countries in Southeast Asia that is 1/5 my price. That's just the reality, right? So I have to deal with that. And what I do, for example, in the case of the Woke Salaryman, is I start a business and I enact my unique vision on the world, but that vision has to be original and it has to be profitable and it has to work. So that's the challenge, because I also think like on the entrepreneurial side of things, like young people in Singapore also have a good position to start off with because your currency is strong. Your currency is strong relative to the region, so you can sort of leverage the more affordable labor in your regional neighbors, and you're in the same time zone. You can do calls. You don't have to fly there all the time. But I think there are great opportunities here. So I would really encourage young Singaporeans to try and to push to recognize your weaknesses and strengths.
Yeah. I mean, to be fair to Singaporeans, I think the culture of entrepreneurship is not something that happens overnight, right? I think right now we're starting to see a lot more startups sprout out in Singapore. I think there are also a lot of people saying like, is it that Singaporeans are not entrepreneurial? Yeah, but these things take time,
True.
For the past 57 years, we relied a lot on, the like government corporations, kind of like holding our hand and setting up structures, that Singaporeans could trust. But I think in the future, moving forward, we will need to be more entrepreneurs. So it's not a matter of do we want, is that we will need to be more entrepreneur if we have to maintain our edge over our neighboring countries.
Right, and I think even that holds for large companies, that because of the level of competition, because of the challenges from, say, digital banks and fintech, that even large financial companies have to be more entrepreneurial as opposed to just relying on their large size and assume that that's just going to stay there forever. But it is an interesting irony, isn't it? On one hand, there's a lot of discussion around the world about deglobalization, how the world is fragmenting, but to the point that both of you just made, that in terms of the demand for labor and the transferability of skills through the internet across the world, we are more globalized than ever before, and there's just no way to turn that back. That genie is out, regardless of whether the US China decide to go their separate ways or not. You guys have been very generous with your time. I want to end on that final note. You've talked about this a couple of times during this conversation, but let's talk about it in greater detail. I see that you've done some sponsored content. So walk us through the difference between the stuff that you do on your own and then, I guess, getting paid to push certain angles, either for the government or some companies.
So our usual content, let's just call it organic content, is the stuff that Richard and I talked earlier. We just come up with it based on what we think would be a suitable angle for audience. So we do the agenda setting. When it comes to sponsor content, the sponsor does the agenda setting, but we decide whether or not to take on the client itself, and we decide how the message should be phrased and like to what extent the client gets to decide their agenda. Because let's face it, not all sponsors are sponsors worth taking on. For example, we will never do sponsorship for, let's say, a cigarette company. Or let's say a car company that sells $1 million cars. So I think we do have some markers that we steer clear of when it comes to sponsors.
Yeah, I think like right now still most of our money is made on sponsored content. Our approach to that is that we are open to exploring other avenues, and we are quite sure that this will not last forever. And I don't know what happens, but we're making hay while the sun shines, but we're also open to creating other avenues of making money. Our approach to sponsored content, I think, is something that there is no perfect balance that everybody will agree with. But we have our own code in which we decide what to take on and what not to take on. And we are okay with sleeping at night, even if people might disagree. The way that we like to do our stories, sponsored or not, is that every story we feel has to stand on its own organically. Meaning, if there was something that happens with this client that we disagree, right? If we take the client sponsor mention out of the story, right, would the story still work organically? And we try to make sure that every single thing we do, right, the answer to that question is yes. So there are actually instances, for example, that we have made the content, something with the client not happy, or the client, we have one case where a client actually went bankrupt, right? So we just took the client sponsor out, then we just put it on as it is. That also, I think, in a way, makes it very good for us to negotiate, because whatever happens, we know that if you want to jump out, it's okay. We just don't get paid for this piece, but we can still use this material.
Of course.
So it makes us a bit, I always say we're very yaya papaya. I mean, like, we're a bit difficult to negotiate with sometimes, but I also think like this comes with the fact that we take a lot of ownership and we put our skin in the game when it comes to publishing, because it means a lot to us. And that is also a USP that we add. We don't just take your thing, we summarize your brief and put it out. We believe in it and we will put our own touch on it and we'll take ownership of it. Yeah. Whether or not you will be along for the ride ultimately. And that's how we maintain sort of our integrity.
Yeah, and of course, I think it's perhaps worth saying that we reject
a lot of stuff.
Yeah, we actually reject most of our clients. Yeah. No, sorry, most of the proposals that
prospects.
Prospects that come in, because sometimes it's just not a good fit. And I think during 2021, there were so many opportunities to talk about crypto and
that's right.
Man, so much like
yeah, and I mean, we had to turn those down. But I think in the long term, when it comes to being the change you want to see, or when we want to talk about social impact, I think that is the more. It will be the wiser thing to do.
I mean, we've had this existential discussion before early on where we said like, look, there are so many sponsors coming in. If we took all of them, despite of whether like we agree with them or not, we would make enough money that we could retire like in maybe 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
You know? But then doing so might ruin our reputation, so we won't have the brand for 10 years. And I think we decided to take the latter one, which was to retain our reputation and our authenticity, our morals. And then I always, when we're rejecting clients, I go like, wow, will I live to regret this? Like in 50 years' time when I'm not a rich person, I'm not retired, and I should have taken all that money. But I think being able to sleep at night is a very important thing to me. Yeah.
Look, there are so many different revenue models on the social media platforms. Some people sell the data to advertisers. I think what you are doing, which is being very transparent about who's sponsoring you, and your message is not getting diluted, your branding certainly is not getting diminished. I think what you're doing is absolutely spot on. And the fact that you can sleep at night, what more matters, right? Ruming and Vishun, you guys have been fantastic. I wish you the best of luck, and I look forward to seeing more things from the woke salaryman in the coming months and years and decades. So thank you so much for your time and insights.
Thank you, Taimur. That was fun.
It was great to have you. And thanks to our listeners as well. Kopi Time was produced by Ken Delbridge from Spy Studios. Daisy Sharma and Violet Lee provided additional production assistance. Kopi Time is for information only and does not represent any trade recommendations or investment advice. All 84 episodes of Kopi Time are available on YouTube and all major podcast platforms, including Apple, Google, and Spotify. As for our research publications, webinars, and live streams, you can find them all by Googling DBS Research Library. Have a great day.